Hello, listeners, and welcome to Homegrown KC, a podcast dedicated to exploring Kansas City's fascinating history and sharing stories from its rich past. I'm your host, Laura. Joining me today is Stuart Hinds, the curator of the Special Collections and Archives at LaBud at the UMKC University. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I invited Stuart to join us today to talk about Glama, which is the Gay and Lesbian Archives of Mid America. But before we dive into that, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been a local history librarian in Kansas City since 1995 and been with UMKC since 2008. And we started Glama in 2009, so it's really been part of almost all of my UMKC experience.
And how did you get into history and archives?
Um, I got an undergraduate degree in history from UMKC, from this school. And then when I went to library school at the University of Iowa, I landed a student job in the Iowa Women's Archive, which was housed right next to the library school on the same floor, and fell in love with the work and just the notion of archives and archival work. And so when I graduated in 94, um, bounced around a couple of part-time jobs and then landed a gig at Missouri Valley Special Collections at the Kansas City Public Library.
Oh yeah, I just talked with Matt Reeves, who works there last. Actually, I'll take it back, like a month ago now.
Yeah, he's awesome.
It's a wonderful archive, the special collections.
Yeah, he's
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's right. I was just gonna say Matt's an awesome guy.
Yeah, he is. So, the focus today, I really want to be Glama. I will probably have you back on later to talk about LaBud in general. But can you give us a brief overview of LaBud?
It's LaBuddy.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That's all right. And LaBuddy Special Collections is named after a former director of the library, Dr. Kenneth LaBuddy, and we are home to the library's rare books and manuscripts. And the rare book collection is pretty much a Western Americana collection with a focus on Kansas and Missouri, so late 19th century American Western history. And the manuscript collections um, focus primarily on the performing arts and, in particular, music. We have probably the best Kansas City jazz collection in the world. Um, and then we also are collecting in traditionally underrepresented communities like women and the local Black community and the local Latino community. And then, of course, the LGBT community through Glama.
Mm-hmm. His name is escaping me, but the first of these interviews that I did was with what's his name from the music archive.
From the Sound Archive?
Yeah,
Yeah, Chuck Haddix.
Chuck. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was like, it's right there. I almost had it. And he was also wonderful. So, LaBuddy takes care of several different things. Then you must be really busy doing a lot of stuff.
There's a lot of stuff going on, but it's all good. It's all good, so I can't complain.
Well, let's go ahead and dive into Glama. How did it get started? Why Kansas City? Because you don't think, at least um, as an outsider of the culture, I don't think of Kansas City being a gay hotspot.
Um, well, I've lived in Kansas City for 40 years, 41 years, and um, so and like I said, I've been in local history for 25, 26 years, and I first thought about a gay archive when I graduated from library school in '94, because at that point people were still dying of AIDS in a really
Hmm.
serious way, and my concern was what was happening to their stuff, the stuff of their lives, their photographs, their letters, whatever it might be. And that of course, was the time when people still wrote letters. And didn't have the capacity to take it on independently or connect with a community organization to do it. And so it sort of stayed in the back of my mind until until 2009, late 2009, when the Kansas City Museum received a donation of all the A's Walk T-shirts up to that time. And I knew the director of the Kansas City Museum, and he's a good friend, and the director of archives at the Jackson County Historical Society in Independence at that time, also a good friend. And the three of us, as gay men, were interested in really starting this archive. And so we took this donation of the T-shirts as the opportunity to formally start this partnership, and that's how it got started. Um, we figured there was interest in it and there was history there, but it wasn't really until we got going that we recognized just how strong the interest was, and then started uncovering really interesting stories. So we didn't start out thinking that Kansas City was a gay hotspot, but we wanted to start collecting the artifacts and documents of those communities to see what would turn up.
Very cool. So, what kind of stuff have you found now? I was browsing through your website. I saw that you had a lot of different collections, and I'm assuming these are organized by the donor.
They are like most archives. They are organized by the donor, the individual or the organization that created or generated the material. Um, well, it's interesting because it was three white guys, right, who started this thing, and so our concern was we were going to have trouble connecting with, in particular, women. And as it turns out, that hasn't been the case. Um, at this point, Glama is probably maybe 55% men or men's organizations and 45% women or women's organizations, with a little bit of percentage of stuff from the trans community,
Okay.
trans organizations, uh, and actual individuals, not organizations. So, so really, it's all over the place. I went into it thinking we would hopefully be able to collect um, more intimate, kind of domestic, sort of personal documents, and that's been the hardest thing to collect. As a matter of
Hmm.
fact, um, it's really been sort of the outward facing kinds of materials from organizations or from individuals who were activists, for example, or lawyers, or um, had some sort or actors had some sort of visible role within the community. Um, so
I can see how reaching out to an organization and then tapping into their network would make it easier to get organizational artifacts. But after that, why do you think it's been so difficult to reach out to the individual people?
well, I think it's a matter of how people view their own stuff. You know, I was talking about this with somebody else the other day in a different context, but like say your grandma dies, and your goal really is to just get her house cleaned out, right? And we in an archive are looking at it from a very different perspective, and we want to save a lot of that stuff. And I just think people um, don't have the realization that their letters or their postcards or their ticket stubs from a concert would be of interest to an archive.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a good point.
but it's been really interesting to see how Glama has grown, because once we do connect with individuals, whether they were in an organization or it's their own personal stuff, um, they will say, "Oh, well, you should talk to person X because they were involved in Y," and
Hmm.
uh, and then that person recommends us to two or three other people, and so it's really just snowballed uh, in that way. Uh, we've never done any sort of formal advertising. I mean, especially early on when Glama first got started, and we had to let people know what we were. We would have a booth at AIDS Walk, or we would have a booth at Pride, um, but the most success has come from that one-on-one referral.
Yeah, I can see that. So, how many collections do you have now then?
That's a very good question. Uh,
Ballpark number's fine.
Dozens. I would say we're probably approaching 100, if not more than 100
That's
individual.
awesome.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've clearly connected with a community that wants to preserve its history,
Hmm.
um, and uh, it's you tend not to see this kind of response to a collecting initiative in an archive. Normally, it's not nearly this active. Um, so it's been really really gratifying in that respect.
Are you facing any difficulties with housing, like spatially? Or do you think you're going to need to move to a bigger venue?
We are blessed here at Millie Nichols Library in that, about around the same time Glam started, we built an addition to this building that is nothing but storage. It's an automated storage and retrieval system. So it's high density storage, and it uses a robotic crane, a robotic cherry picker, to retrieve shelves or metal boxes full of bound material. So we have space, and that's very very unusual for an archive. Typically, that's the main concern, is that you're going to run out of space, and
Right.
that's not that's not a concern for us right now. And I hope to be retired before it becomes a concern.
Well, that's also awesome. Congratulations.
We'll see.
Oh, sorry, I'm blanking. I had another question lined up. What was it? Oh, I was asking about collections. Okay, here we go. So, what is your favorite piece or most surprising piece that you've collected so far?
Um, I don't know that it's a piece. I think it's a story more than anything else.
Okay, we love stories on Homegrown Casey.
The fact that the first ever gathering of gay and lesbian civil rights leaders, um, national gay and lesbian civil rights leaders, took place in Kansas City in February of 1966.
Wow. See, yeah, I had no idea.
These were, the Martin Luther Kings or the Gloria Steinems or the Cesar Chavezes of the gay and lesbian movement, and they were all here in February of 1966 because they had been working, for some of them, for 15 years, and needed to connect one on one, but connect collectively with other people doing similar work to see how they might join efforts and not duplicate efforts, and figure out ways to collectively move forward with this movement. And it just happened that one of the people involved had lived in Kansas City and worked for the Kansas City Star, and so he knew people here, he knew the community, and the community here was very receptive to hosting these folks. So it happened at a hotel at 12th and Wyandotte.
That is amazing. Do you know what the what's the word I'm looking for? What the results of this meeting were?
Sure. So they came together and they spent, it was a weekend, gathering, and they spent most of the time just doing introductions, right, and figuring out infrastructure like you do when you start a new organization.
Mm-hmm.
But they came away with several concrete objectives, one of which was to investigate the possibility of setting up a national legal fund that people who had been arrested, which happened all the time all across the country,
Mm-hmm.
could tap into if they needed support. They they walked away with another meeting planned for the fall of that same year in San Francisco, and most importantly, they walked away with plans for the first nationally coordinated protest, gay and lesbian protest, um, to bring attention to discrimination against gay men and women in the military.
Okay. This protest, is that the March on Washington, or is that a separate protest?
Now, March on Washington is much, much later. This was a separate protest, took place in about 8 or 10 cities, and it was on Military Remembrance Day in May of '66.
Okay. As I said earlier, I was browsing through your website and I came across an article that you had written in 2012, which really snagged my attention about the evolution of the female impersonation in Kansas City.
Uh huh.
And this is something that I came across first when I was doing all my jazz research a couple of years ago. Can you tell us about your research in this subject?
Sure. It's absolutely fascinating. Uh, I mean, I could go on for the whole podcast. I'll abbreviate a little bit. So, as early as 1860, there was a law on the books in Kansas City that prohibited appearing in public in clothing that was inappropriate for your sex. So, men couldn't appear in public in women's clothing, and women couldn't appear in public in men's clothing. And so, what you see are accounts of people being arrested for violating this municipal ordinance. Um, and being fined really significant fines or going to jail. And all through the second half of the 19th century. But what you also see, particularly towards the end of the 19th century, are performative impersonators, gender impersonators, both male impersonators and female impersonators, coming through Kansas City. Kansas City's always been a big theater town, and they were a regular feature of music halls and later vaudeville as you get into the 20th century. And so it's this dichotomy of arresting people for being on the street uh, in um, for cross-dressing, as they called it at that point, and celebrating these performers on the stage. Um, and then you get into the vaudeville era, and Kansas, and that starts the development of circuit theaters, what we would now call chain theaters.
Hmm.
And Kansas City has a number of those circuit theaters in town, and so the performers, particularly the female impersonators who perform in those circuits, come through Kansas City regularly. You see all sorts of um, accounts of reviews, all sorts of stuff around the vaudeville female impersonators. And then um, as vaudeville fades away by the early 1930s, late 20s and early 30s, and you start to see the rise of cabaret culture, um, then you see uh, the venues change for female impersonators, but um, there's the practice is still going on, particularly in the late 20s and early 30s. It becomes really, really popular, and to the extent that there's such a thing called the pansy craze that is sort of based in New York and spreads throughout the rest of the country.
Is that pansy as in the flower?
Yeah, it was a derogatory name for gay people, for gay men in particular.
Right.
Um, and so of course, during all of the 1920s, what's in force is prohibition, the prohibition on the consumption and distribution of alcohol. And when prohibition is repealed in 1933, um, it is accompanied by really a clampdown on bars and taverns and nightclubs. And what you see across the country is um, the disappearance of female impersonation, because those bars and taverns were where the shows were happening. And I mean, it disappears in New York, in Los Angeles, in smaller cities. There's evidence of it just going away pretty much everywhere. It's a real backlash, except in Kansas City. and San Francisco and New Orleans. But for our purposes, what's of interest is Kansas City. And the reason that female impersonation lasts well into the 1930s, the very late 1930s, is because of Pendergast.
Mm-hmm.
Pendergast is in power until 39, and so the town is still wide open, even though Prohibition has been repealed. And there's all sorts of evidence of a variety of female impersonators at different clubs across the city and in the 18th and Vine district in downtown. There's a club called Dante's Inferno that becomes known for its female impersonation. So it's just a really interesting notion that it's going on in Kansas City while it's disappeared everywhere else in places as conservative, ostensibly, as Kansas City.
Mm-hmm.
And so then um, World War II is difficult to I have had not much luck finding evidence of civilian female impersonation during the war period, and even post-war, particularly in this part of the country. There's just not there again. There's not a lot of evidence. It's not until the very late 1950s and early 1960s here in Kansas City that it picks up again, primarily um, at a venue called the Jewel Box Lounge at 3219 Troost. And the Jewel Box becomes known nationally um, on the drag circuit and insanely popular, primarily with a straight crowd. People come into town, from Liberty or Raytown or wherever, and mom and pop come into town. They go to dinner. They want to go see a funny show, a show of the funny ladies at the Jewel Box. And so they do, and it becomes crazy popular. Um, and the Jewel Box stays on Troost until 72 when it relocates to 3110 Main. There's a Wendy's at 31st and Main. That's where the second Jewel Box was.
Oh,
The,
okay. Yeah, I know right where that is.
right by the bank, right? Yeah, right there where that Wendy's is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the building that housed the first Jewel Box is still standing, crazy enough, over on Troost. It's apartments now. Um, and so and there were performers at the second Jewel Box, or excuse me, at the first Jewel Box on Troost, who had performed 30 years previously at Dante's Inferno during the Pendergast period. So it's just a
Wow,
really,
that's a long time.
yeah. This and one person in particular, Ray Bourbon, had a very interesting career, and he performed, like I said, at Dante's Inferno, and then ended his career at the Jewel Box in the '60s. So it's
And so, in your research, did you, um, I mean, did the scope of your research did it stop with the move to the second jewel box, or did you find anything after that in the 70s and 80s?
there it changes come the post Stonewall era. I've talked with performers who are still around who performed at that time, and particularly in the early years right after Stonewall, the first half of the '70s, um, drag queens were not welcome because um, the people who were newly liberated as a result of the Stonewall riots didn't want to be affiliated with drag queens. That changed as the decade went on, and also what you see during that same period is the rise of um, pageantry uh, and competitive pageantry, and the infrastructure of that really starts to be put into place during the '70s, and that really raises the profile of the practice and the quality of the practice. Because if you're competing against someone for a title, then your makeup's going to be better, your wig's going to be better, your performance is going to be better, and your clothes are going to be better, right? So,
Right.
so that really just does help to add some polish to the practice, and then of course with the onset of the AIDS crisis in the early '80s, because there was no response there was no to minimal response from varying levels of government, local, state, and federal. Um, Yet there was need for funding to address this health crisis. Um, the first place that many people turned to were the drag queens. They had a track record of making money, and um, they responded positively. In Kansas City, there was a troupe that started in 1986 called the Kansas City Trollops that did nothing but perform to raise money for the agencies that were providing services to people with AIDS. And they would perform 3 or 4 times a week. Um, they were a comedic troupe, and did kind of raucous, crazy shows, and really raised a lot of money. I don't think there's ever been an accounting of how much they raised, but they also raised a lot of spirits because they were so goofy and silly. And then come the 90s is when you really start to see the mainstreaming of drag into the culture at large. And in Kansas City, that happens in large part through a group called Late Night Theater, um, and they were known for doing these parodies or satires, kind of mashups, cultural mashups, as they would be called maybe today, um, and they would be done in drag, and they were insanely popular. There's well, back before COVID, they had stopped performing for a while, but then they revived and were performing quite regularly at Missy B's. Um, I haven't seen anything since COVID about a return of late night theater, but they were the big deal on the scene for quite a while.
They may still return. Everything is slowly opening up again now.
It's all in transition, so we'll see.
Yeah. That's a very interesting and long, much longer than I thought, history there. When I had come across it the first time in my jazz research, I thought that it had kind of died out entirely after Pendergast was gone, but it sounds like it stayed strong, at least in Kansas City.
Yeah, and I would argue across the country, because you see evidence of it, in all sorts of cities.
So you mentioned oral histories, and that's something else that I had seen on your website. Are these oral histories that you have conducted yourself?
We have, yeah, I've conducted some on behalf of Glama when I can find the time, or if I know of, um, if I can just arrange it. And those have tended to be with more senior members of the community before they
Hmm.
go away, right?
Right.
And we've got a number of other oral histories. A set that was done by a volunteer who interviewed couples on the subject of love and marriage at the time of the Supreme Court decision around the Defense of Marriage Act, the Windsor case. Um,
Hmm.
and then we have a number of, and most of the oral histories are audio only. Um, so they would probably be appealing to a podcast listener. But we do have some videotaped oral histories that were done in conjunction with a project called the Ordnance Project, which was a documentary film made by a PhD student here at UMKC in the history department, focused on the response to the AIDS crisis and then the subsequent passage of the ordinance that prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation and or HIV status in 1993. So he did a bunch of oral histories with people who were activists in those movements, and some of those are available on the Glama website. And I have taught a class uh, on U.S. gay and lesbian history here at UMKC, and I usually teach it with somebody else. And the last time we taught it was 2018, which was the 30th anniversary of the first World AIDS Day. And so we assigned our students, and there were about 120 students in the class. We assigned the students um, a project to do an interview with someone who was alive during the height of the AIDS crisis. And we defined that as, I think, 81 to 95. And it didn't matter who it was. It could be their parents, it could be their preacher, it could be a teacher, didn't matter. But talk to them for a minimum of 10 minutes about their experiences during the AIDS crisis. And we have put, I want to say, around 65 of those up.
So yeah, I understand that oral histories are a very large. Man, I'm so not good with the words today. It's a very large commitment. It takes a lot of time. You have more planned in the upcoming months, years.
There's always plans to do more. Um, One of the things that we're committed to in our department and in our library is equity and equitable access, and so we don't put up oral histories without a transcription,
Hmm.
so that
So is the priority on transcribing your current oral histories then?
that's key, is getting them transcribed, and that's what takes forever, is and it's expensive, is to get them transcribed. So we chip away at it as best we can, and we put them up as we can, and there will probably, we don't have all of those videotaped oral histories up yet, and those all have transcriptions, and so once those transcriptions are edited, those will probably go up sometime this calendar year.
Okay, cool. Do you have other activities that you're uh, dang it, why am I so bad with the words today? Other activities or projects that you're working on
Um,
besides general collecting, you
the
know?
collecting is always ongoing. Just today, I reached out uh, to the executive director of Thrive, which is the local primary aid service organization, and it used to be known as Good Samaritan Project. And they have been purchased by um, a national organization, and they're going to be folded into that organization. So I reached out to her to see if Glama could help preserve the legacy of Good Samaritan Project and Thrive, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to make that happen. Um, but other projects, really just ongoing efforts to get collections processed, get the inventories, the finding aids up online so people could discover the collections, and
Hmm.
get things like those videotaped oral histories online. We have a timeline, a historical timeline on the website that always needs more stuff added to it. So it's really just a lot of continuation of um, things that have already been established. So there's always plenty to do.
Of course, of course. Before we went into COVID, did you have any um, public events that you would hold?
We did in 2019. We did have a big 10th anniversary exhibit and reception, opening reception for the exhibit here in Labuddy Special Collections. Um, uh, because it was amazing that 10 years had passed and a lot of activity had happened, both in terms of collecting and outreach and programming.
Hmm.
Um, I do speak regularly. Uh, I'm giving a talk next month for the Mid Continent Public Library um, with the gentleman who did the film, and he's the guy I co-taught with. Um, we're going to talk about civil rights activism in Kansas City. I'm going to talk about sort of what I talked with you about the '60s, those folks in the '60s, and the activist organization that came out of that 1966 meeting, the Kansas City Activist Organization. And then he will talk about the the ordinance project, the groups that were involved in the ordinance work. So that is scheduled for June 16th. Glama has a Facebook page. There'll be stuff on the Facebook page about that event. Um, and then a little more quietly, I have a contract with the University Press of Kansas to finish a book on the history of the LGBT community in Kansas City from late 19th to late 20th century.
Wow, how close are you to being done with that?
That was a lot closer.
Wrong question.
Um, there the bits they're significant chunks that are done, and there's significant chunks to be done. So it'll be a while yet.
Okay, well, I'll keep an eye out for it.
Yeah,
And I'll definitely check out your talk. That's awesome. And I'll get more information to put up for my listeners about that.
that'd be great. Yeah, because we haven't gotten the promotional stuff yet from the library system, but
Okay.
should be coming soon. Yeah,
Yeah. 6 weeks out should be coming soon.
yeah,
But they give good talks and they host good speakers.
yeah. They've got the machine for it. I think the just the whole process.
Hmm. All right, so I just got one last question for you here. Like, what is your response to trans men and women gaining more? I'm not entirely sure if acceptance is the right word, but more. Everywhere I'm looking on social media, it's being talked about more. So, what is your response to that, and how are you interacting with that in today's culture?
We are trying to collect all in all aspects of the LGBT communities, and we being me, I stop at LGBT just for brevity's sake more than anything else. I could expand it, but LGBT seems to cover most of it,
Hmm.
and the T has should have every expectation to be as well represented as the L and the G and the B in the archive. Um, we do have a collection from a trans lesbian activist who was active in the 80s and 90s. It's a really interesting collection. It actually sees a lot of use. Um, it's just a matter of making the connections. And as more and more activity from individuals and organizations takes place electronically, it makes it really, really challenging to collect and preserve. It's really easy to create. It's really easy to create a podcast. It's really, really hard to collect it and preserve it long term. And by long term, I mean 50 or 100 years.
Hmm.
And that's the challenge that faces any archivist in 2021, is people's digital experiences and their digital lives, and and organizations' digital lives, and how do we gather those, and how do we, for lack of a better term, how do we put them in a box and put them on a shelf? Um, you know, I would love to see more trans stuff come in. Um, Whatever it might be, a flyer from an event, or the God, a diary or a journal or whatever it might be, whatever an individual or organization has generated to represent themselves or that community. Um, I talked about the sort of binary breakdown of the collections in the archive, um, but where we're seeing challenges in terms of collecting is from a little bit from the trans community, just because I don't think we've made the connections, but also really having challenges collecting from queer communities of color because we haven't made any connections. And I think the way to make those inroads, because it's all based on trust, right?
Right.
And I think the way to make those inroads is to call upon folks for help. My goal, and I hope to make it happen before I uh, pass this along to the next person, is to set up a community advisory board, because I think that will really, really help us. Because Glama's gotten big enough now, it's too big for one person, and I need help, and I need help making connections to pockets of the community that I just don't have the capacity to reach, and that is my long-term goal for the archive, because I think that will help sustain. It will be sustained no matter what, but I think that will help sustain and grow it in the future.
I can see that. So you, um, ideally, you foresee this community advisory board as um, just a more definitive network, a wider network of what you currently have, or a more active role?
A wider network, a more active role. I was in a session this past week with a similar um, archive over in St. Louis, and their community advisory board is like 60 or 70 people.
Wow, that's
I
huge.
know, I couldn't believe it. And they use them for different purposes. They use them for marketing, they use them for fundraising, they use them for, again, making connections in the community. So I really think what we're able to do will depend on the size of the group, and their interest level and their willingness to give energy to it. Um, I am working through the infrastructure of my employer at this time to try and make this happen. And
Hmm.
things move at university speed. So we will see how long it takes me to do this before I just rip what little hair I have left out. Um, but I really do think that is the way to grow the archive in the future.
Yeah, especially if you're going to use them for marketing and fundraising.
I know,
You would think that the university would be a little bit more on board with that.
you would think, but I think it's just a matter of hitting the right people on the right day.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened yet. So we'll see. I'm optimistic. I really am, because the community response and the student response equally has been so significant, um, that as long as I keep pushing, I think I'll eventually break through and get to do what I need to do.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Well, like I said, I didn't have any other questions. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us before we sign off?
I don't think so, other than just my never-ending gratitude to the folks who make Glam happen, which is really everybody out there in the community. So I could not be more grateful or more honored to preserve and make available that legacy.
And do you happen to know your website IRL by heart to give to our listeners?
It's www.umkc.edu/Glama.
Oh, nice and easy.
Yeah.
And you said you have a Facebook page. Do you have other social media pages?
No, just
Okay, well, listeners, check them out on Facebook and go to the website.
yeah.
That'll be all for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, it's my pleasure.
Hey y'all, thank you so much for tuning in today. Let me take a moment because it was never said in the episode and reaffirm my support for the LGBTQ community, especially trans folks. Trans men are men, trans women are women, and they deserve the same rights and protections as all the rest of us. You may notice this episode was recently re edited. I love this version so much better. The old one, the sound quality, it was really terrible. It's actually worse than I remembered when I went back to redo this. And I realized that I hadn't included my music. So I think I just was so tired of messing with the sound quality the first time that I forgot to do a few things. Also, I am taking this opportunity to make my support for the LGBTQ community stronger. It's something that I've realized recently that I have not been as vocally supportive in the past as I ought to have been, and so I would like to take this opportunity to apologize for that. If my words or silence or actions of inactions have caused harm to the LGBTQ community, I'm sorry. Anyways, thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And if you want to continue to support me outside of your monthly donations, make sure you subscribe to Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, Tumblr, and YouTube. Rate and review me on Apple Podcasts. Visit my website, homegrownkc.wordpress.com, and sign up for my newsletter there. Once a month, you'll receive an email that says what's new with the podcast, what's going on. It's just a good way to stay in touch. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can email me here on the Patreon or at homegrownkcpodcast@gmail.com, or on any of my social media networks. You can send me a message. Visit Zazzle, zazzle.com/store/homegrown_kc_ to see what's available, get some cool merch. Thank you goes out to my talented sister-in-law, Sarah McCombs, for the creation of my logo, to the Dear Misses for the use of their song Kansas City as the intro and outro music of the show, to local libraries which enabled me to gather all my research, and a special thank you to you and to Stuart Hinds. Thank you. Bye.
Seem to shake this feeling, and I can't seem to get you off my mind.